Hello, everyone. My name is Ellis Soto, and I'm a PhD student at Yale University. And today I would like to talk about restoring the Galapagos through giant tortoise rewilding. I also want to thank the conference organizers for this fantastic event. The Galapagos can be considered to be lost in the Pacific, stranding approximately 1,000 kilometers of the west coast of Ecuador, and consists of a total of 13 islands, which have a very distinct seasonality. It rains during some part of the year, and it's pretty dry during the other part of the year. Of these total 13 islands, you have the whole range of completely uninhabited islands up to islands with a total permanent population of 30,000 people and more than 250,000 tourists every year. And thus, each of these different islands requires different management actions for sustainability purposes. Recently, there's an increasing interest in rewilding the Galapagos, particularly by restoring lost populations of giant tortoises that were decimated due to pirates' activities and human activities since a young Charles Darwin was visiting the Galapagos. And particularly, it's because giant tortoises provide a very large amount of ecosystem services, such as dispersing endemic seeds, moving around nutrients, and also providing functions such as grazing and browsing. And particularly today, I want to touch upon three topics under which giant tortoises are actually rejuvenating and regenerating ecosystems. We could almost think about giant tortoises as gardeners of the Galapagos, or a mixture of masons and gardeners that are restoring the islands just by being them. I'm going to talk about seed dispersal, how tortoises also accelerate and cycle nutrients in the Galapagos. And I want to mention that another very strong component of this project with a large team of collaborators is informing both the local Galapagos public and also the international public about the activities that we are doing with a lens focus on conservation, but also scientific communication and education. So I'm just highlighting some of these scientific communication products that we have collected on each of these different topics. And I'm a movement ecologist by training. So why on earth would I study how 600-pound giant tortoises move up and down a volcano for rewilding purposes? This is a full-speed adult male giant tortoise that is probably over 150 years old. And we need to study movement for conservation management purposes. We can see that tortoise populations have been decimated to what they were once, and understanding how much space, how much square kilometers do each of these tortoises need, other migration route overlapping with human development or zoning plans. These are the type of information movement ecology can help you with. These are signs that are pretty daily in Galapagos, tortoises crossing a road and crossing a traffic jam. We need to understand how tortoises move to actually have a better understanding of the spatial impacts of their ecosystem services and what type of services these are. Are they localized on only one place? Are they spread throughout the annual cycle of tortoises movement? And we also need to understand how changes in land use and climate change will alter the space use of the Galapagos tortoises. And also, movement ecology is a great way of capacitating the next generation of Galapagos explorers, leaders, scientists, and decision-making. The first case study is on Rewilding Santa Fe Island. And here in the background, we can see how the National Park of the Galapagos is reintroducing up to 5,000 tortoises in Santa Fe Island over the next couple of decades. And this will have severe and strong implications on the functioning of the ecosystem of Santa Fe Island, which is an uninhabited island. So we coupled predictions on the very top on where these tortoises are right now and where they will be as we introduce more and more tortoises and they spread throughout the island and they reach adulthood. And in the bottom plot, we can also start modeling and quantifying the more tortoises and the longer they grow and larger they get, the more nitrogen they will need. And we can build an ecosystem budget of Santa Fe Island and calculate how the introduction and the presence of 5,000 tortoises might change the ecosystem budgets of Santa Fe Island, which is really important to plan several decades ahead and find an adequate number of giant tortoises that have enough resources to thrive in this island. We also couple this with the tortoise distribution per square kilometer, and we can see that there's a saturation once tortoises reach every single place in Santa Fe Island, which we predict will happen this century. Another ongoing research is understanding how giant tortoises are linked to nutrient budgets in the Galapagos, as both in terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. On the left-hand side, I'm just showcasing a couple of figures that show how tortoises actually use fresh water. And you can almost think of them as hippopotamus of the Galapagos. They wallow in these ponds for thermoregulation for several hours a day, moving in mud and pooping in these waters, putting in fresh nitrates from the terrestrial food web. But also, like we see in this muddy tortoise in the bottom left corner, they also bring a lot of materials from the ponds back to the terrestrial food webs, basically engineering these ponds that they're using themselves. So with a very high technology tool, basically a plastic spoon and a muffle furnace, I've been scraping off tortoise mud from these shells, and we found that tortoises move over an average of 300 grams of dry mass every time they move in and out of pond, and that there's differences whether these freshwater ecosystems are located in areas with human activities or not. So if we have several thousands of tortoises in the Galapagos moving 300 grams of mud every single day, we can almost think of them as bulldozers or as a mixture of gardeners and masons, as I've said before. Why do we want to restore ecosystems in the Galapagos Islands besides preserving biodiversity and endemic species? Well, it's because a very large amount of the economy, human livelihood of people living in the Galapagos is ecotourism, and also valuing and better understanding the ecosystem services and also the scientific contribution that these unique species have had to the discipline of evolutionary biology in particular is very hard to quantify, but it's of incredible importance for our legacy. So now I'm going to switch gear to a very inhabited island, Santa Cruz, which is home to 30,000 people. And by tagging giant tortoises with GPS collars, we were able to investigate how these tortoises use this island of Santa Cruz. And we can see here that tortoise tracks are colored, and what is a red polygon in the middle of the island is agricultural zones full of introduced species or agricultural species such as passion fruit and guava that are used by humans. But tortoises walk in and out these ecosystems and are actively foraging on these invasive plant species. And if you see Santa Cruz Island from space, you can see that if you were at the very top of the island, you would be almost in sort of a somewhat dense forest, while you're walking towards the coastline, you will be transitioning towards more of a grassland landscape. And once you hit the coastline, you will see a very dry exothermic vegetation. So giant tortoises throughout their annual migration in this island encounter a very large range of different plant species that they disperse, ranging from endemic to introduced. And this is something we wanted to investigate further. And after looking into more than 250,000 seeds in tortoise tongue, we found that tortoises mostly disperse introduced species, which is of major conservation concern, and for adjusting conservation prioritizations in the Galapagos, as these several of these introduced species are highly invasive and are damaging endemic flora and fauna. Particularly, we've been focusing on guava, which is delicious in a smoothie and actually turns out to be the most eaten and favored plant species to be consumed by giant tortoises. And what we found in this box plot is that when comparing the distribution of guava as trees in the Galapagos, we found that they're currently distributed between 400 and 150 meters in elevation, but that guava presence in tortoise poop is present throughout the entire island. So tortoises are potentially aiding, almost like a taxi, this introduced and highly invasive species to arrive into new habitats. And what we can also do is we can build almost a tortoise pooping simulator, since we know how many tortoises are in the island, how much they move, and what type of fruits they eat. We can incorporate all these different data sets and build almost a model that tries to predict where these tortoises are moving throughout the year and where they will be dispersing guava seeds. And we can also identify the major concentrations of guava by this endemic tortoises inside the national park, and then let the Galapagos National Park know that these are areas with a very high likelihood of invasive guava at the forefront of the species distribution, which will greatly facilitate eradication action of this invasive plant. This is how such an approach looks like. On the very left, we have simulations of what tortoise tracks could look like, and these were parameterized using real data. And on panel B, we can see how we expect these tortoises to be dispersing seeds of guava in a landscape. However, it's clear that not every single one of these seeds is going to germinate and become a tree. And in order to account for that, we can basically assess how is the environment in Santa Cruz Island right now or in the future, build models that assess these climatic suitability for guava in the future, and use this to adjust our predictions and say, Actually, there's much less areas where guava can germinate and become a tree right now, which is much closer to these higher areas of Santa Cruz Island. But we could also switch this up and say, how is the climatic environment on the Galapagos changing under climate change, and how will this affect seed dispersal by giant tortoises? And with this, I hope I can provide you a very brief introduction in all the ways in which tortoises are shaping ecosystems in the Galapagos, and how rewilding is actually a very long-term project, especially with giant tortoises that live 200 years. It makes you really put time and management actions into a different perspective. And I wanted to acknowledge every single one of my collaborators, and thank you so much for listening.